My name is Ruset Pătrașcu. I am wrestling coach in Greco-Roman style. I am going to present technique and tactics Greco-Roman wrestling procedures, and I will start first with back arch and its variations. The program will be commented by Jim Graylis.
Ruset will now demonstrate back arch. The hand position is very similar to shaking hands. He will step in, lift with his thighs, keeping his back very straight, exploding upward. For the first variation, Ruset will have his opponent step in. He will step in, left foot and finally the throw, demonstrated by Jaron. For the second variation, Ruset will pull forward, his opponent will step back and resist. He will step in, the right foot being much deeper than the left, back arch. Jaron now demonstrating the throw. For the third variation, Ruset will step in, both feet parallel, in between his opponents. His opponent resisting back, stepping in, exploding upward, power out of the thighs. Darren will now demonstrate. For the fourth variation, it would be Ruset's left hand, tie on his opponent's right, stepping in, dropping from an underhook to around his waist, exploding upward. Kevin will now demonstrate the throw on Jeff. For the fifth variation, Ruset will trap his opponent's arm between his body, lock on the head, then drop to the waist. Must lock underneath the elbow. Kevin will now demonstrate the throw. Emphasis must be placed on exploding upward, force coming out of the thighs. For the sixth variation, Ruset will slap his opponent's head. His opponent will resist back. He will lower his level, execute a body lock and throw, as demonstrated by Kevin. For the seventh variation, Ruset will go to a double overhook, step in, both feet in the middle of his opponent's, upper body straight, finally the throw. For the last variation, Ruset will step in, pulling his opponent forward to get the resistance, executing a body lock, stepping around his opponent with his right leg, executing the throw. This ends our back arch series. Ruset will now demonstrate the basic moves towards the proper execution of a headlock. First, Russ will demonstrate the pivot step and turn. He's keeping his upper body straight. With a very smooth pivot step. The explosive force of a headlock comes out of your legs. In executing a proper pivot step, your right foot must be inside your opponent's toe. For the first variation, Reset will apply an underhook, headlock, and the throw. For the second variation, Reset's opponent will push off his shoulder. He will apply a headlock and a throw. For the third variation, Reset's opponent will be in the headlock position. Reset will counter with his own headlock. For the fourth variation, Reset will grab his opponent's opposite wrist, apply the headlock, trapping his opponent's elbow, and a throw. Keeping the elbow locked as it hit the mat. For the fifth variation, Reset will pull his opponent forward. His opponent shall resist back. He will step in. And that was the last variation. Reset will now demonstrate 7 more variations off the headlock, the first being from a Russian tie, stepping in, executing the throw without locking his hands. For a second variation off the Russian tie, Reset will demonstrate a throw, locking his hands. For the third variation off the Russian tie, he will pull his opponent. His opponent will resist back. He will step in, execute the throw without locking his hands. For his fourth variation, Reset shall pull his opponent in, step in, execute the throw with locked hands. For his fifth variation, Reset will grab his opponent's left hand, step in off a collar, execute a pivot, and execute the throw without locking his hands. For his sixth variation, he will pull his opponent's head. His opponent will resist back. He will step in, grabbing his opponent's right hand, executing a throw. For the sixth variation, Reset will pull his opponent's head. His opponent will resist back. He will grab his left hand, execute a pivot turn, and a throw. For the seventh variation, Reset will use a wrist and collar tie, executing a pivot turn and a throw, not locking his hands. Reset will now demonstrate 8 more variations of the headlock, 3 from a tie-up situation. In the first variation, he will pull and force a step from his opponent, executing a pivot step and a throw. For a second variation off a tie-up situation, Reset will force his opponent's bicep up with his elbow, executing a pivot step, and the throw. For the third variation off a tie-up for the headlock series, Reset will lower his level, faking a duck under, stepping up, executing a pivot turn, and a throw. For the fourth variation, Reset will execute a sag headlock off a Russian tie. He will pull his opponent in, getting his opponent off balance, pulling him to the mat. For the fifth variation, Reset will miss the headlock and go to an arm throw situation. For the sixth variation, Reset will also miss a headlock, will reach across his opponent's back, and execute the throw. For the seventh variation, also off a missed headlock, Reset will drop to his knees and execute a roll. For the eighth variation, Reset will show a headlock counter. The opponent trying a headlock, Reset stepping around him, executing a body lock and throw. This is the last variation of this series. Reset will now demonstrate improper techniques for why a headlock does not work. The first one will be if the hip is extended outside your opponent's hips. The second will be when executing the pivot step, you drive your opponent's hips away from yours. The third will be a demonstration of improper upper body position. Reset will now demonstrate 5 variations of the arm throw. The first, grabbing his opponent's wrist, executing a pivot step, pulling his arm over his right shoulder, executing a throw. For a second variation, his opponent will grab his wrist. He will execute a pivot step, pulling the arm again over his right shoulder, hitting the throw. For the next 3 variations, Reset will work off his opponent from a 2-in-1 situation. forcing into his opponent, grabbing him above the elbow, executing the throw. In the next situation, he will go from a 2-on-1, breaking his opponent's grip, forcing him to step in when he resists, executing the pivot step and the throw. For the last variation of the arm throw, he will break his opponent's grip, again from the 2-on-1, executing a quick pivot step and a throw. Rousset will now demonstrate 4 more variations of the arm throw. The first one, he will force his opponent to step. He will execute it from the near side, a duck under, lifting him with his right elbow. For a second variation, he will force his opponent to step. He does not resist. He will grab his opponent's far wrist, push into him to set up an arm throw. For his third variation, he will execute an arm throw from a collar tie, stepping into his opponent. For the last variation of this series, he will demonstrate an arm throw from a collar tie where his opponent will now allow him to step in, so he will pull his opponent into him. Rousset will now demonstrate 6 more variations off the arm throw. In the first situation, his opponent will have a 2-on-1 situation. He will break his opponent's grip, grabbing his opposite wrist, lifting his elbow, rotating the arm to come to a parallel position, then rotating into the arm to execute an arm throw. Rousset will now demonstrate a second variation off the same situation. One in which his opponent will step back. In the third variation, Rousset will have the 2-on-1 situation. For the third variation, Rousset will have the 2-on-1 situation. Pulling his opponent in, he will execute an arm throw. For the fourth variation, Rousset will tie both of his opponent's wrists, pushing into his opponent, receiving resistance back. Pivoting to execute an arm throw. For the fifth variation, Rousset will have both his opponent's wrists tied, He will twist his right wrist to the outside, executing a pivot step, tying his opponent's wrist behind his back, executing an arm throw. For the last variation, Reset will tie both his opponent's wrists. His opponent will reach to grab his forearm. He will pivot and execute an arm throw. Reset will now demonstrate several non-related series moves. First, a wrist and collar tie to a front headlock situation, pivot step to an arm throw. In the second variation, his opponent will collar tie Reset. He will counter with a hip throw. In the third variation, Reset's opponent will tie his near wrist. He will counter with a hip throw. For the fourth variation, from a similar situation where his opponent will tie his far wrist, Reset will counter with a hip throw. In the fifth variation, Reset's opponent will push off of both his shoulders. He will tie both his opponent's wrists and execute a hip throw. For the sixth variation, Reset will execute a hip throw from an underhook situation. In the last variation, Reset will execute a hip throw from an underhook situation where he slides back to his opponent's elbow. This completes our series.